What an honor to have Coach Tom Osborne here with myself. I'm Ron Brown. You're one of your hosts today, but I obviously I don't have to introduce Coach Osborne to any of you. You all know who he is and what he has done here at the University of Nebraska. I think in addition to being a great football coach, obviously, arguably the greatest of all time, certainly in the conversation, but he's also a great leader. And so what an honor it is to talk to him about leadership. And there's actually been a great book written about Coach Osborne's leadership. It's called A Legacy of Leadership, written by Gordon Thiessen, and there are a number of people who are featured in it. In fact, I have Gordon Thiessen here with me as well. And so I'm really excited to have both guys here. In fact, I'm going to kick off the introduction with Gordon. I want to start with you, Gordon, Gordon, of course, is a former player here for Coach Osborne back in the 1970s out of Lincoln East High School, scholarship player, defensive end, at a time when Coach Osborne was in his early stages as the head coach here. But Gordon has also been involved with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. He's now involved with me in a ministry called Kingdom Sports. Gordon has written a number of books, has worked with Coach Osborne on several book projects before. So, Gordon, I want to ask you, how did the legacy of leadership come about?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that question, Ron. And just a little edit, just so you know, I didn't actually write this book, but I did publish. And so it's a little bit different there. I wouldn't want Coach Osborne to think I was stealing his thunder here. But I think it's interesting to know the background of this. I worked with Coach Osborne all the way back to, we did the On Solid Ground book back in the 90s. That was one of the first projects we did. We did a couple after that on mentoring and teammates. And so we had done several projects, and a little over, I suppose, a year ago, I just stopped to see Coach and really didn't have any objective, no particular project. I just was stopping in to see Coach. And in fact, I think, Coach, you even said, well, what do you need, Gordon? Because usually I need something when I come see you. And I said, well, Coach, actually, I just on a schedule, just a time, just talk, just catch up with you. And we did that. And it was good to catch up. And I was kind of actually in the hallway, headed down the hall, and Coach said, hey, Gordon, come on back. I just had a question for you. And he said, next time I saw you, I was just going to ask you about a publishing question book. And he said, I've done several books and done some stuff on leadership. And one of the things I did is kind of out of print. I'm kind of wondering what to do and what's kind of your advice, and could you help? And of course I said, I'd absolutely do anything to help. And I had just made two suggestions. One was if we were going to do something to update on the leadership book, that it's been a number of years since Coach had written on it. I knew he had a lot of experiences as an athletic director, even in Congress. And I thought, wow, there's more Coach has to say on this. And in fact, I was pretty sure he had a lot more to say. And so I just suggested maybe we refresh, update some things he did when he taught a class at Creighton on coaching and leadership. And I just thought, let's try to beef it up if we can, if there's more there. And I suggested a guy named Chad Bonham that could help with that effort. Mm-hmm. But also the second part of it was to add possible interviews from former players, coaches, family members, to kind of really flesh out what it is to be loyal or a leader or be courageous, all those different components of what a great leader is. And so Coach was nice enough to trust me on that. And so worked real hard and came out with the legacy of leadership. And we subtitled it, as you can see, Coach Brown, Leading with the End in Mind. And so there's a lot here, I think, just in terms of leadership. And so I'm just excited, and I'm just trying to really help people know that there's probably 50% at least of kind of new material on leadership. So if they've got one of the books from the past, they actually probably want to get this one as well. And I think the stories, I think you'll talk a little bit about one of your stories, the stories really enhance it. So I think you've got everybody from the Governor Jim Pellin, who played for Tom, to stories about you, Charlie McBride, Craig Bull, just a variety. I think we've got about 50 different contributors. So there's a lot of stories that flesh out this idea of leadership. And I know that Coach has been really good actually to sign some hard copies, some hardback copies, limited edition copies for folks. And So we've got those at the Ticket. They can find those at the Ticket, but they can also find those at crosstrainingpublishing.com. And so there's only so many of those he's probably going to be able to sign, but I'm especially excited about those limited edition because not only as a former player that I have the privilege to publish this, but Joe Mixon, who's a photographer and a former player, where you were able to use a lot of Joe's pictures and my photos that are in that special hardback edition.
Well, I've had the pleasure of reading the book, and I really think it's outstanding. I don't really read a lot of books anymore. I don't have much time to do that, but I made a point to read this one, and it really spoke to me again after all these years that I've been with Coach Osborne, coaching for him for all these years. That book enhanced and reminded me of so many things that are so valuable and unfortunately are kind of disappearing in the culture today. That's what I love about the book. I believe it brings up things from a biblical perspective and a cultural perspective that are essential today for leadership. In fact, I hear people say all the time, you hear the phrase, don't judge a book by its cover. Okay, we won't judge this book by its cover. It's a good cover. It's got a picture of Coach Osborne on it. It's got nice, writing on it and everything. But you're right. I mean, what's inside of the book is what's really important. So we want to encourage you to get that. In fact, this book that Coach Osborne wrote, and forgive me for totally missing that, but understandably, I as I looked at it, I'm really not surprised at the loyalty that he shows in the book. And so it reminded me of an incident that's in the book when I was debating whether to go to Florida State. Coach, you might remember this, Coach Osborne, with Bobby Bowden and at the end of the day, Bobby Bowden brought up the salary piece. He says that Tom pay you that much? I said, well, he said, certainly we got more to give you. And I said, well, Coach, what I'm getting from Coach Osborne is about what you guys have offered. And he said, that Tom, he says, how's he pay all that much? I said, well, Coach Osborne's very generous. I said, he gives us a lot of his shoe money, his camp money. He's very generous with the assistants on this and that, bowl money, so forth and so on. And he doesn't really take a whole lot for himself. And Bobby Bowden was just like amazed. He just said, well, that Tom's paying you too much, all that. But we had a good laugh at it. But do you remember that? Do you remember anything like that? Did you know that your loyalty kept we assistant coaches here at the University of Nebraska?
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Of course, I wasn't party to that conversation that you and Bobby had. But, Bobby is a good friend of mine. And so, yeah, I always felt that whatever money the head coach receives is due in large part to what the assistants do. And so sometimes you'll hear of a CEO or somebody that's running a corporation or whatever receiving millions of dollars in salary, and then the average employee is maybe 1/100th of that amount. And I never felt that was fair. And so whatever success we had, the assistants were a big part of that. And so it was just, I didn't feel it was anything that was inappropriate. I just felt that we all shared in it. And so sometimes the head coach had his name on certain contracts, but I felt that you guys were really a big part of whatever happened at Nebraska. And we were fortunate because we did have a good deal of continuity. And sometimes we'd line up the first series of downs, and we'd been working all week against a certain defensive structure. And because of the kind of football we played, sometimes we'd see something that was entirely different than what we'd been working on. But the good thing was we had enough institutional knowledge. We'd say, well, I remember when UCLA did this to us 5 years ago at Milltown, or could call that up, or Frank Solich or whatever. And so I think that the continuity of the staff was very important. The average assistant changes jobs in major league in major college football about every 3 years, and our continuity was much greater than that, and that was very helpful to everybody.
Well, the gravitational pull back then, it's interesting you bring that up, was to assistant coaches. Look, you only stay at a place 3 years, and then you got to move. You got to go here. You got to go here. You got to figure this out. You got to go. That's why people were telling me at Florida State, well, they throw the ball there. They don't throw the ball very much in Nebraska. So if you really want to climb the ladder, you got to do this and that. And, what really helps lead, and you're humble enough to say this, to continual continuity, which leads to really, in many ways, victories, eventually against teams that have beaten you at some point. You come back and you find ways to beat them, is the consistency of the coaching staff. And I can tell you this, I know this for a fact, money wasn't the issue for us assistant coaches. I think we were all paid enough. I think what the issue was the loyalty that you demonstrated to us. It was hard for any one of us to leave you. I don't think that was the gravitational pull in the profession was to leave, but there was a greater gravitational pull within our program, and that was our relationship with you. And so one of the things that I think really that pops up a lot is the fact that there was a consistency in the program. And what I mean by that, it's not just the same coaches, but it's like in the practice sessions. We had a practice session that involved every coach, but also every player. Our players weren't standing around. It wasn't just half our players getting reps. There were a whole bunch of players getting reps. And I think a lot of the coaches that, like a guy like Craig Bohl, who moved on from Nebraska, North Dakota State, built a tremendous situation there at North Dakota State with some national titles in FCS football. Then he goes to Wyoming, he does the same thing. A lot of people kept practicing that way. Nick Saban even heard about the way we practiced, and he took that same approach at LSU and Alabama and places that he was. So, Coach, could you talk to us a little bit about the consistency that you believed in through just even how we were doing football, like practicing and reps for all of our players?
Well, I think the thing that you're referring to is the fact that we when we went to teamwork, we had 4 stations. We had 2 offensive stations and we had 2 defensive stations. And what that meant was that most of your players were fully engaged. They weren't standing on the sideline watching. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, in most football practices, you'll see 1 offensive station and 1 defensive station, and maybe 75 or 100 guys standing and watching. And so the number of repetitions we got in practice went up exponentially. And as a result, I think we were better at developing players because, you may end up with the right guard. You might have the first and the second right guard get hurt. And we always had somebody who was third at that position could step in and had enough repetition to perform well. And also, when you graduated, like most years we graduate most of our offensive line, but we had those guys on the second offensive line developing enough that they could step in, and we didn't drop off like many schools did. So I think that style of practice was important to us. And I did go down to Alabama. Nick Saban asked me to come down, and I talked to him about the way we practice. And I think that some coaches were able to latch onto that. But traditionally, most coaches I talk to, they want to gravitate back to the way they've always practiced. And that's 1 offensive station, 1 defensive station. And it made a difference. But I think from the standpoint of leadership, I think that it was important that it wasn't all top down, that every assistant coach had an area of responsibility. And when we met, I always tried to make sure I had adequate input from everybody. the surest way to shut down contribution from your staff is to tell somebody that's a stupid idea or not listen to them. And eventually it just shuts down. And but we felt everybody was important. And so when we met, everybody had a chance to have input. And then, of course, eventually you'd have to decide what it was you were actually going to do on that given day. But anyway, that's just the way we operated.
We're talking to Coach Osborne in the legacy of leadership. And Gordon, did you have something there?
Yeah, just two things, because those are two great stories that pop up in the book. But Coach Brown, when you had told me that story many years ago about Florida State, Bobby Bowden, when Coach Osborne and I were talking about the book and how I'd like to add stories like that, he said, well, Gordon, give me an example. And I said, well, let's just take loyalty. I told him the story about you and Bobby Bowden in Florida State, and he looked at me and said, Gordon, I never heard that story. And Ron, you might remember I called you on my way home. I said, you never told Coach Osborne that the rest of the story? And you laughed and said, I just felt almost like so disloyal when I got back. I just said, I'm staying, and you guys never talked about it. Yeah. And then the second thing is, we talk about the practicing. I was with Coach Darlington about the time we were talking about these stories and books. And I said to Coach Darlington, who was the 30-year assistant for you, I said, Coach, is there an interesting story that you would contribute or something that's unique for leadership? And he said, yeah, I think it's the way we practice. Because he said a lot of programs don't do that. So he told me about Saban taking basically the formula of practicing the way you did it, using that couple different places, but still using it at Alabama. Because I kind of said, is that an old school thing? Is that something? He said, no. He said, Saban's doing it at Alabama. And then he said, in fact, you ask Craig Bull about it when you get him for an interview for the book, because Craig did it at North Dakota State and then still does it at Wyoming before he retired. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the stories that I thought were fascinating that just really flesh out some of these principles.
Well, one of the tremendous things here in Nebraska, and I think the whole nation knows about it, is that we weren't always getting 4 and 5 star guys. We got a lot of 2-star, 3-star kind of kids. We had a lot of walk-on players, kids within the state as well. But what was happening, and Coach Osborne, you used to have a statement. You used to say this all the time that always struck me. He said, hey, catch somebody doing something right. We always have the mindset as coaches, we're looking for flaws, we're looking for mistakes, catch somebody doing something wrong. That's what sometimes leadership becomes. Sometimes it's I'm the gatekeeper, I'm kind of the police, quotation, the police of the area. But you are always looking for something good in someone, even from someone who maybe the world didn't expect that from. And that's one of the whole principles of the practice is everybody gets a shot, everybody gets developed. A lot of our 2 and 3-star players were developing into 4 and 5-star players before they finished their career at the University of Nebraska. So I think that just the whole principle of maximization of our talent and the quality of the ability that we had took leaps and bounds that took our team to heights that many people wouldn't have reached, because all they were doing was just playing us a few number of players, the so-called stars. But Coach, speaking of that, I wanted to move into the other topic that I think has captured the heart of Nebraska, a young man named Brooke Berringer, who kind of fits the role that we're talking about right now. And you included in the story under the servant leadership section of the book some things about Brooke. Just wanted to have you reminded of your time with Brooke and our time together with him.
Well, Brooke was a young guy who had come to our football camp in the summer, and he's from Goodland, Kansas, and probably never played more than in front of a crowd of more than 300 or 400 people at Goodland, and probably didn't have a whole lot of recruiting interest, but we liked what we saw in him and offered him a scholarship. He came here, and he was behind Tommy Frazier. And Tommy, of course, was a great player, very gifted, very heavily recruited out of Florida. And it didn't look like Brooke was maybe going to play a whole lot. And then Tommy was diagnosed with blood clots in his legs. And all of a sudden, Brooke was the guy. But he had been getting quite a bit of repetition as the number 2 quarterback because of the way we practiced. And stepped in, and we won 7-8 games in a row with him, even though he had a collapsed lung and he had some injuries along the way. And we finished up the year, and both Tommy and Brooke played in the final national championship game against Miami. And then the next year, of course, the question was, well, both of them had been starters for us, and who's going to start? And we graded every play in fall camp. And I think that the difference was Brooke had 1 interception during fall camp. Tommy had none. And so Tommy started. And Brooke didn't play much that year. He played usually in mop-up roles, but he never started another game. But his reaction was interesting because he was a young man of strong faith. And if somebody from a elementary school wanted a speaker, or somebody wanted somebody to visit somebody in a hospital, Brooke would go. And even though it hurt him not to be the starter, he supported Tommy, and he said the right thing, did the right thing. And then, as you know, after his senior year, Brooke was flying small private plane, and the engine crashed, and he was killed. And the interesting thing about that was we had a funeral out in Goodland, which was probably an 8-hour drive, and I thought we'd have maybe a 1 busload or 2 busloads of guys who would go to the funeral, but we had 5 busloads. Every player on our team went, I think, to that funeral. And I think it was partly because of what Brooke did in 1994 as a starter, but mostly because of the way he handled the next year and the fact that he was totally devoted as a team player. And so he was a guy who made a great contribution, and I think had a great influence on all of our players, even though he didn't start more than that 1 year.
Well, Coach, I go back even, I was, of course, involved with Brooke in the recruiting process. And I remember when he came to camp that year as a high school boy, and he wasn't highly recruited. We were, at the time, recruiting a young man named Cordell Stewart out of New Orleans, who was a great run-pass high school quarterback, maybe the best in the country, considered by all the gurus. But there was something about you that said, I really like Brooke. He's close geographically. He fits what we're all about. He's got size. He's got speed. He can really throw the football. And even though he wasn't highly recruited, you decided to say, you know what, this is what we're looking for here. Another mark of great leadership. You don't just follow the crowd. We don't just take Notre Dame's recruiting list and say, well, we're going to just recruit those guys. We do the homework ourselves. We watch every single play. It's not just a highlight tape of the kid. We watch him in everything we do. We invite him to camp. We get around his folks. We do a thorough job. That was your definition of recruiting, and we didn't always maybe please all of the celebrity seekers out there in terms of recruiting, but we got the guys that we felt were right for our program. And I go back. Cordell Stewart ended up going to Colorado. Cordell never beat us. Brooke in the head battle with Cordell won that one in 1994. We had the right quarterback, but a few years earlier, you made that decision to go in that direction. And I think that has a lot to do with you and as a leader. And so just going and staying on that same theme, what were some of the challenges that you faced, along the way in selection of players or discipline with players and so forth? And how did your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ impact your decisions along the way?
Well, I could just go back, and historically, something happened the first year that I was the head coach, 1973. And we all of a sudden had national legislation which governed the size of the recruiting class. And previous to that time, the Big Eight Conference, which we had been members of, we had 45 initial scholarships per year, which was at the upper end of any other conference. And the thing that we had that really set us apart, we had no upper limit.
Mm-hmm.
So if you recruited 45 guys and you all stuck around, you're going to have maybe 150, 160 guys on scholarship. And then in 1973, there was a national legislation. And so it limited the initial number. I think it was maybe 30 that year, and eventually went down to 25. But then there was an overall limit. You could only have so many. You could only have, I believe, 85 scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thing that was important is I noticed that when we had 45 scholarships with no upper limit, sometimes the very best players we had were not the first 5 or 6 or 10 that we saw, but it was maybe the 45th or the 44th or the 43rd. And these are guys you could no longer offer scholarships.
Mm.
So we thought, I think maybe there's some kids that will walk on.
Mm-hmm.
And we treated those walk-ons exactly like we treated the scholarship players. Recruited them the same, went to their high school, went to their homes. And if we could get 15 or 20 good walk-ons, that not only offered a chance to get some good players and develop them, but also it affected the character level of the team, because usually a walk-on, by definition, was a guy who was an overachiever, willing to pay a greater price. And so I remember one time I talked to Doug Coleman, who was a heavily recruited player from New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
And he was saying to me, he said, came to Nebraska because I thought maybe it could get me in the NFL. But then I saw how those walk-on kids worked and how much it meant to them. And it kind of changed my perspective. And it wasn't anymore just about me and where I could get, but maybe being a contributor like they were. And so those walk-on players, a lot of them played for us. Some of them didn't play as much. But some of them, as I talk to them today, have told me, they've done really well in business. They got education. And they've said that that experience was really important to them. Mm-hmm. And even though they didn't play or start, they felt the way they were treated and things they learned along the way were important. So I think the walk-on part of it and kids from small towns and places like that were important to us as time went on.
I just want to add, Ron, I came in 1975. I was a scholarship player, and I remember on the freshman team, there was a guy named Isaiah Hip. Later, we'd call him I Am Hip. Mm. He was a walk-on from, I think it was North or South Carolina. Nobody knew him. I think he had a one-way ticket, walk-on, and everybody was asking, who's that guy over there? We saw him take off and run, and we thought, oh, wow, who is that guy? Of course, he went on to be one of the most famous walk-ons, a fantastic running back. But that system of merit was very important to how we were successful in the 70s. Now, there were times that kind of bugged me because I'm probably one of the unique guys that was a scholarship player that was beat out for a starting position by not one, but 2 walk-ons. First, Derry Nelson, and he was younger than me, and I thought, okay, there's a spot opening up on the other side, defensive end. Maybe I'll get a shot here. And then eventually another walk-on, Jimmy Williams, came along. Those are 2 guys that were just more athletic than me, quicker, better. Of course, like any competitor, I thought, I think I'm better, but I really wasn't, because these guys both went on and played in the NFL. But they understood that even though I was a scholarship player, a Lincoln kid, the best player is going to play. And again, that might have been hard for me at times, but I stayed my 5 years, lettered. I was super thankful, but I always knew I would be treated fairly. Mm-hmm. And if I was playing the best, I would have a spot. If not, somebody else is going to get it. But that's what makes a successful program, is when it's merit-based.
Yeah, and let me put in a word for you. You were a good player.
That's nice for you to say.
You didn't end up in the NFL, but
Yeah.
you were a very strong contributor. Yeah.
Well, my grandkids will appreciate hearing that. So,
Well, even here, I mean, just that being said, Coach Osborne, one of the things that I think we all appreciate about you is the ability to see through situations. The Bible says that the eyes of the Lord search to and fro across the earth, looking for one whom he could be strong through. And I'm not equating you with God. What I'm saying, though, is that that's a characteristic of a follower of the Lord, is one who doesn't just go by, statistics and what everybody else says and recruiting hype, but actually looks at the film, actually spends time, actually drills that guy, actually gives that guy enough time to develop and really chisel out to be all that he can be before you make a premature decision on him or just cast him off. And you were always very special at that. I think, to be honest with you, as the Bible also says, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. That's what Jesus said. To deny yourself is really hard. I mean, we want to kind of all exalt ourselves. I think one of the most interesting stories in the book was the story of Spencer Tillman, whom we were recruiting. You were recruiting him from Oklahoma. I believe that's where he grew up, right? Mm-hmm. And Oklahoma was recruiting him. And it sounded like he wanted to really come to Nebraska, but Nebraska didn't have the academic discipline, if I'm correct. And you suggested, hey, we don't have exactly what you want in engineering or whatever it is. I suggested you go Norman, Oklahoma. University of Oklahoma has that degree. You probably ought to go there. I mean, who does that? Who turns down a great player? What head coach does it? Don't we call the professors and say, hey, we have something we can tell this kid or for him to come here? But your integrity level didn't seem to allow you to do that. But maybe you could, if you remember that situation, maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I remember Spencer was really a good player, but he had his heart set on petroleum engineering. Mm-hmm. And I think his family had some interest in an oil well somewhere, maybe owned some land. And so that was his interest at the time. And so we eventually told him, Oklahoma has petroleum engineering, and they were our rival.
I know.
And he was a good player, and he started for him. And so he went to Oklahoma. And but we felt it was important that we be upfront with people. We didn't want to pretend that we had petroleum engineering. I guess we could have sent them over to some department and said, well, we don't really have that major, but we can maybe fill in the gaps somewhere. But Spencer often talks about that. And of course, eventually he became a broadcaster. I don't think that major ever really was something he pursued.
Well, Ron, the one thing that Spencer told us when he gave us that story for the book was he knew one thing about Tom Osborne. He could trust his word.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whatever it was in the future, he could trust Tom Osborne.
Yeah. I sat in a lot of homes with Coach Osborne. We were recruiting guys, and I was always waiting for Coach Osborne to deliver the punchline. Hey, you come here, you'll play next year, you'll get to do this, you get to do that. Never once did he say that. He would say, well, we're not a bad team. I mean, we're 11-1 last year. We're not a bad team. I think you'll have a chance to play at some point, but you got some work to do. And the way I was brought up, I was thinking, this is not a sales job. You need to be a salesman if you're going to be a recruiter. But no, you absolutely need to be a man of integrity. That's who you need to be. And I learned that from Coach Osborne, and many of our assistants and players learned that as well. It always seeps over. The stories come back. Spencer Tillman comes back and says, hey, let me tell you what happened in my life. Let me tell you what was astounding that a man would be willing to do that. So I know that's always embarrassing probably for you as a humble person, but Coach, it seems to be lacking in today's world. People are cheerleaders instead of umpires, and you were calling balls and strikes and saying, hey, this is a good decision. This isn't a good decision. I mean, why, Coach? Why would you do that?
Well, I think that long-term, long haul, if you have a bunch of players on your team that have been made promises that are really almost impossible to keep, like you're going to be a starter for us. I mean, that's not fair to the other guys you already have on your team.
That's right.
To promise playing time to somebody who's not really proven it or earned that they earned the job. And so I think in the long run, that backfires on you because you end up with a lot of unhappy people who feel like I was told this, but it really isn't that way. And so we felt it was important that we could certainly tell a player, yeah, we really think you can play for us. We really think that you'll be a fine player. But I was never willing to say, you're going to start for us next year. You're going to start for us as a freshman, because those guys were few and far between. And you might have 10 guys, and maybe only one would ever be somebody of that caliber. And so I think in the long run, the chemistry on your team would be better if they felt like they were treated honestly and fairly when they came here, and there weren't any unexpected consequences.
That's why I love your book. I love the integrity reminder. Integrity means one as a whole number can't be divided. What you think is what you say, is what you do, is what you are. And that's integrated. That's an integer. That's what that word means. And so we could always count on Coach Osborne telling us the truth and living out that truth, even over a period of time. So we're all appreciative of that. The other thing, Coach, that really hits me about your leadership that is really evident in the book is you had a vision. You were a visionary. You know, for example, you brought in Boyd Epley, who is a young pole vaulter, and as a strength coach that really changed the game in many ways, becoming America's first really well-known strength coach and developing what we had here. How did that come about, Coach? How were you able to see ahead all those years, if you were at the time?
Well, we'd had some good teams. I came here when Bob Devaney became the head coach as a grad assistant. I was just a young guy on the staff. We had, I think, 3 or 4 Big 8 championships. And then in 1967, we were 6-4. And all of a sudden, we weren't quite the toast of the town. And then in 68, we were 6-4. And the last game of the season was against Oklahoma, and we lost that game 47-0. And we didn't go to a bowl game. And so there was a lot of criticism, and Bob, there was even a petition in Omaha going around to get rid of Bob. But that wasn't probably serious, but most people were serious that Bob ought to get rid of some assistants. So Bob came out and he said, if one guy goes, we all go. So that kind of set the tone. And I always appreciated that about Bob. And but anyway, the thing I'm trying to get to here is that things were a little dicey because we then won a couple national championships. And when we took over in 73, then things had changed. I mentioned the NCAA rules changing and so on.
Right.
And so, and I have to cut this. I kind of lost my train of thought. What were you saying about?
I was talking about bringing Boyd Epley on as a strength coach.
Okay, so anyway, in 78, toward the end of that season, I lockered down with some of the assistants, and we happened to have some track guys around us. And I lockered next to Boyd, and Boyd kept telling me, he said, I think I'd make you a better football team. And Boyd had gotten into weightlifting, and he was a pole vaulter, and he'd gotten bigger, and he was breaking a lot of the poles. The poles were bamboo poles at that time. So the track coach was unhappy with Boyd. and not really wanting to keep him around because he was expensive. And so anyway, I took Boyd in to see Bob Devaney because we'd had those 2 years that were pretty rough, and Bob was willing to listen. And so I told him I thought maybe Boyd could help, and Boyd talked to him. And Bob was kind of old school, and of course, at that time, the idea was among most football coaches that weightlifting wasn't good for you. It would make you muscle bound, comb your hair. And so I remember what Bob said. He looked at Boyd. He said, "Okay, Boyd," he said, "I'll give you a chance. But if it doesn't work right away, you're fired." And, so we both gulped a little bit. He hired Boyd, and Boyd became the first full-time strength coach that I know of. I don't think anybody had a strength coach. And he kind of revolutionized the game. He had something like 60 or 70 assistants of his that went on to become full-time strength coaches other places because people saw what we were doing here. And but he was definitely ahead of the curve. And I think we try to do things somewhat innovatively. Nutrition, I don't think anybody had a full-time nutritionist. Academic counselor Ursula Walsh, a former Catholic nun, took over and kind of revolutionized our academic approach. And I kept getting these letters from this lady, and she said, "I've observed your study hall, and I think I could do a better job." And the problem was that at that time I was running the study hall. so I got a little irritated with the letter. About the 5th letter, I called her in and I thought, I'm going to straighten this out. But she impressed me so much. I said, "Yeah, you could do a better job." And she did a great job for us and kind of revolutionized some of the things we did as far as academics. So anyway, what you try to do is to keep innovating and trying to stay ahead of the curve a little bit.
Well, Boyd and Ursula certainly weren't short on confidence, and you were able to see that. And the book points that out, and that's part of being a visionary. And, the other thing, Coach, it really obviously took a tremendous amount of energy. It was probably in response to difficulties, maybe not winning a bowl game every year. I remember right after the 1990 season, I believe it was, we started the Unity Council. Is that correct? Was it around that time?
1992.
92, yeah. Yeah. And that was another one of your innovations as a coach. And Coach, you talk about it in the book. How do you think it could play out into the world today, that the business world, let's say, or the nonprofit sector or other sports? What did you really value about that Unity Council?
Well, first of all, I think we need to give credit where credit is due, because we'd had reasonably good seasons in 1990, 91, and 92, but I think we were 9-3. Maybe one year was 9-10-2.
Right.
But I just felt we weren't where we could be, and so I talked to a guy named Jack Stark up in Omaha. Jack was a sports psychologist, and he seemed to have some ideas, and so we got together, and I said, my feeling is that this team is probably not as unified as it could be. We're not as committed to a common cause, and so he thought about it, and he said, "Yeah, we could maybe start something called a Unity Council." And so what we did was we had the players select 2 players from each position, 2 offensive linemen, 2 defensive linemen, 2 running backs. And so we had about 14, 16 players selected, but they were selected by the players, not by the coaches. And their charge was to meet every Tuesday night and bring up anything that they felt or saw that was getting in the way of team unity. It would be simple stuff like, well, we had hot dogs at the training table twice last week, and we don't think we ought to have hot dogs that often. Or the equipment guy is grumpy and he's throwing towels at us. And these are things I would never hear about, And And so I'd get up in front of him the next day at the meeting. I said, okay, I'll talk to the cook, and we won't have as many hot dogs. Talk to the equipment guy and settle him down a little bit. But you also want to wear Nike shoes instead of Adidas. And we have this thing called a contract, so we can't violate the contract. But anyway, the point was that a lot of things that would never come to my attention were brought forward. And then we also developed a discipline code that those guys came up with, and they agreed to. Everybody understood that's what you had to do. So anyway, I think it was very helpful to have that Unity Council, and it was an integral part of a pretty good run the next 5 years. I think we only lost 3 games and did pretty well.
Well, there's some wisdom in that thinking and giving a level of accountability to those who work for you. That probably applies in a number of businesses and other endeavors. And Coach, when you decided to eventually retire, after the 1997 season, your third national championship as a head coach at Nebraska, what's amazing is that we use the word retirement, but you really didn't retire. You didn't retire from life. I mean, it might have been your last football game that you coached, but you moved into the world of Congress, in the political realm. The teammates program had been started, and you were moving that and mentoring people all over the world through that organization. What keeps you going? I think when people retire, we tend to think, well, we'll just go put our feet up on a porch somewhere and kind of rock on the rocker and sip lemonade and kind of drift into the sunset. But that wasn't your definition of retirement. I knew you were still a young man at 60 years old. But what kept you going? What was it inside that just kept you overflowing into the culture?
Well, I still had a fair amount of energy, and the reason I retired wasn't necessarily I was fed up with coaching.
Mm-hmm.
I had told Frank Solich, one of my assistants, that I would go 5 years, and 5 years came in pretty quick, and we had 2 players, Grant Wistrom and Jason Peter, who came in to see me, and I hadn't told the players I was planning to retire. And I thought I was going to hear the speech, well, I've got to do what's best for me and my family. They were both All-American players, and they were going into their 4th year. And so quite often you see people who say, well, I'm going to declare for the NFL draft and skip my last year. And that was about the time that I had told Frank I would be retiring. And so they said, well, Coach, we lost 2 games this last year. I said, yeah, I remember that. And they said, well, we're coming back. And we think we can do better. And I said, well, that's great. So then I went to Frank. I said, Frank, these guys are going to come back, and I think I can't consider really leaving while they're going to come back. And would it be okay if I coach 1 more year? And he said, okay. So we did that. But then because of that promise to Frank, I decided that was when I should go. But I still had quite a bit of energy, and I had a grandfather who had run for Congress many, many years ago. And I thought, maybe that's something I could do, because there was a congressional office open. Did that for 6 years. Can't say that the 6 years in Congress was the highlight of my life. A lot of travel and away from my wife a lot. And but it was something that was meaningful. But I think the thing that I noticed over the years, Ron, was the changes in the family structure. When we went out to recruit in the early 60s, very seldom would we run across a young man that wasn't growing up under the same roof with both biological parents. And as time went on, that began to change.
Mm-hmm.
And today, over half of our kids are growing up without both biological parents. So the family structure had changed. The drug culture hit us about 1970, 71, and that was really discouraging and distracting. And then a lot of the messages that kids were beginning to receive through the internet, music lyrics, movies,
Mm-hmm.
and then now with social media. And as a result, it's really a lot more difficult for kids to enter adolescence and emerge on the other side of it in reasonably good shape. And so I got in front of the team in 1991. I said, how many of you guys be willing to serve as a mentor to some 7th or 8th grade boys? And 22 hands went up. So we matched them up with some kids that the Lincoln Public Schools had given us. And we had really good results. And then it grew from there and went on pretty well. Yeah.
I remember that day. When you met with those young men, and that was impressive to see. I also remember the day that you called me and each assistant coach the day you retired. And that was a sad day. That was a really sad day for me. I was out recruiting in California, and it was 1997. I'm thinking we're getting ready for the 98 season, excited. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to go into a recruit's home that night, I think, and explain and talk, but it was painful. And I think that was true of every player and every coach on our staff. We knew that there was more ahead for you. We could see the energy in you. This story is not necessarily what I'm saying is not necessarily in the book. I don't think that's in the book, but just to give a context of the book, it was very, very difficult for us to let you go from the game of football. And yet you were too talented. You had too many gifts to be contained just in the game of football. And a lot of your great work was done even after football continued on. But certainly we were going to miss you as a football coach and for what you stood for in so many ways. So I just want you to say, or just hear from you, what do you hope others will gain from reading your new book, The Legacy of Leadership, that you wrote and was published by Gordon Thiessen? As we've been interviewing here today, what would you like the hearers of our show today to gain from that new book? What's really important to you regarding that?
Well, I think when most people think of leadership, they think of what we would refer to as transactional leadership. It's this for that. It's reward and punishment. Do a good job, we'll get you a raise. Do a better job, you'll get a new position. And if you don't do well, we're going to have to demote you or fire you or whatever. And so that's transactional leadership. We've all grown up with that.
Mm-hmm.
And but there is something called transformational leadership, which is synonymous with the word servant leadership. And I think that in the scripture, Jesus was speaking. He said, whoever would be greatest among you must be the servant of all. And so it's not necessarily a traditional style of leadership, but I think the important thing is that a meaningful and a purposeful life really doesn't result from serving yourself, being the center of the universe in your own mind, but rather it has to do with serving other people. And so that was sort of a transition for me. I think early on, I was under the gun because I knew if we didn't win a lot of games, I'd go get fired the next year. Mm-hmm. And maybe a little bit more transactional, but some transformational. But I think as time went on, I think that the idea of servant leadership became more and more important to me. It wasn't that I was perfect at it. You've said a lot of nice things about me today, and I just want everybody to know I'm really not that good. Ron eventually got around to exaggerating a little bit, and Gordon. But anyway, I think that was the general premise. And it was very painful for me to leave coaching, but I'd made a promise to Frank, and I felt I had to keep that. And I also felt that at that time I could leave coaching and have Frank take over and the staff remain intact. Mm-hmm. And usually when you leave coaching, that isn't the way it works. Usually you're leaving feet first, and there's a lot of chaos and a lot of people that get hurt. And so I felt I could continue something that was pretty solid. And Frank, I thought, did a good job. That you guys did a great job of carrying on. And probably the firing of Frank Solich was one of the really difficult things that the Nebraska football program experienced. Mm-hmm. I think even from hindsight, people can understand that now. Right. Because Frank's going into the Hall of Fame here in about 3 weeks, and did a great job later on in his career.
Well, Coach, as before I turn it back over to Gordon here on some of the details of how to get the book, I just want to say, I had the unbelievable privilege of being maybe in the best seat in college football, working for you for 11 years, and then several more when you were the athletic director here at the University of Nebraska. And I gleaned from that leadership. I've never been a head coach, never been an athletic director myself, but I've had to lead my family. I've had to lead other organizations. I've had to lead my position groups. And this book, The Legacy of Leadership, reminded me of all those things that I'd learned from you as I worked for you those 17 or so seasons. And it's just a refreshing, I think, account of what leadership should look like, biblical leadership should look like for followers of Christ and even the world at large. So I just personally want to thank you for, even beyond the book that you wrote, which is great, and you've written other good books, the life that you've lived. That's stamped in my heart, and I'm forever thankful to the Lord for that. And I didn't think I exaggerated at all. I think beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I beheld it for a number of years. But let me bring us back to Gordon, so our listeners will know how to get your new book, The Legacy of Leadership, which I think is one of the best books ever on leadership.
Yeah, Ron, I appreciate that. Of course, a lot of people order books these days on Amazon.com, and so there are paperback editions of the book there. But I do want to mention, because we are kind of, as we tape this, we're going into the holiday season, and so there is a limited edition we did of hardbacks with color photos, and Coach was kind enough to sign some of those. So those are limited, but folks can find those at our website at crosstrainingpublishing.com. I believe that Ticket FM will maybe have some downtown here, and I have a link on their website where people can find those if they would like to get those. But again, those are limited. I would like to just, as we're closing out, just add one more story, because I think it's an important component of the book, and that's the word love. Mm-hmm. It's a love and appreciation for players, other people, coaches. I know faith is where that comes from. And just recently I had a former teammate that played with me in the 1970s, Tim Hager. He was a quarterback that played for Coach Osborne at Lincoln Southeast kid. And Tim's been out of state in Colorado for a number of years, and he had called, and I think he'd probably seen Coach Osborne like some guys, maybe at a reunion dinner or something like that. But very often you don't have much time other than just say, hi, how are you, Coach? And he had called me and said, Gordon, is there any way I could just get to spend a few minutes with Coach Osborne? And I said, I think absolutely. Let me check with Tom and just see. So we got to spend just recently about an hour with Coach Osborne. And I know Tim meant a lot to him all these years later, because again, he finished in 1980, and he had Coach Osborne impacted his life in the 70s. And I know Tim just had mentioned how much that meant to him. And even as we left after an hour and said, Coach, what do you got going on? He said, well, I've got to go meet with one of the young men I'm mentoring right now. And I thought, there's no stopping Coach Osborne. It's back to leading with the end in mind. It's that example that I'm going to lead. And I appreciate that. Ron, you and I just turned 68 and, we're not retiring from life. We know the Lord has us for a reason here.
Right.
And so I'm hopefully an example to my grandkids, but I can also look at Coach Osborne and say, there's a guy that I can follow. There's a guy that has shown me the way over the many years. And so, again, I think love and appreciation is what I think of with Coach Osborne.
Well, we want to thank you and the audience who have listened to Coach Osborne and Gordon and myself as we've talked about Coach Osborne's recent book, The Legacy of Leadership, an outstanding read. I think it's for everybody, moms, dads, coaches, young athletes, people in the business world from all over the stratosphere should read this book. I think it will inspire you or remind you of what humility is all about, right living, moral living, but most important, it's an honest account of what real integrity looks like. Coach Osborne, I want to thank you for being with us. We got more time to spend together, and I just thank the Lord for you. I'm honored. Gordon, thanks for being with us as well.